Welcome to Eat, Drink, Think. I'm Amy O'Neill Haug. In this podcast from Edible Communities, a network of magazines published across North America, we celebrate all things local and sustainable in the food world. Today, we're speaking with culinary historian Sarah Lohman. Sarah got her start in food history when she was just a teenager, cooking historical food at a museum. A passion for food and history stayed with Sarah throughout her studies and into her work at New York's Lower East Side Tenement Museum, where she served as culinary curator. She now works with institutions around the country to create public programs focused on food. Sarah is the author of 2 books. Her first is 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine, and late last year, her new book, Endangered Eating, was released. Later this fall, it comes out in paperback. Endangered Eating is a culinary travelog with a distinct purpose, telling the story of foods and food traditions that are in danger of disappearing. We'll talk about how Sarah chose what foods to cover and how eating these endangered foods may or may not be the key to saving them. Sarah, welcome to Eat, Drink, Think.
Thanks, Amy. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. In Endangered Eating, we discover that you have a source list for choosing which foods you cover in the book. The list is called The Arc of Taste, and it comes from Slow Food International. Can you introduce us to the organization and how the ARC works?
Sure, and I'm sure that a lot of your listeners who are engaged with the edible communities might also be engaged with the slow food community too. So slow food started in Italy in the 1980s. It was sort of in direct response to a McDonald's, a fast food restaurant opening up near a Roman landmark. And so it brought about this idea of slow food. What's the local? What's the handmade? A few years later, the Arc of Taste was invented. This is an encyclopedic reference that lives online of, at this point, internationally, globally, I think over 6,000 entries, and here in America, over 500 of the endangered, the threatened, the hyper-local, the rare, the special foods from all across the globe. And that work came to America in the early 90s. I have to say that they sort of had to rewrite the rule book for us because a lot of the rules that worked for European food traditions didn't work here. At first, they were only onboarding is the term they use for entering an item into this encyclopedia. They could only do it with indigenous foods based on the guidelines set about in Europe, about how long a food had to be produced in a certain place. And part of the problem with that was at that time, there were no indigenous people on the board. So they started onboarding indigenous foods, and indigenous people were like, actually, we don't want some of these foods to be public knowledge. These are our foods, our traditions, and part of protecting them is keeping knowledge of them in a very limited circle. Now there's also Slow Food Turtle Island, which it's basically the indigenous arm of slow foods, and it's made up of indigenous nations, not just in America, but all across the world. So I think we've all thought about like pandas being endangered, right? But like I was first introduced to the Arc of Taste through an endangered pasta. And that is what really sent me down this rabbit hole of learning not just about the Arc of Taste and the work of slow food, but also about what that means for America.
So you said 500 entries so far in the U.S., and you got this idea that you wanted to study some of these and write about them. How did you narrow that list down to just 8?
Well, I set aside a day. I set aside an afternoon with a cup of tea. And again, it's free. It's online. They do have a book out now that highlights some of the items on the American Arc of Taste, but it's also all online, the whole thing. So as you go through there, it's largely volunteered run, the whole organization and the Arc of Taste. What regions are reflected in the Arc of Taste are a sort of direct correlation where who has had an active slow food chapter past at present. For example, here in Southern Nevada, there's not even any Mojave foods listed, which is something I want to change. But that's also because our slow food chapter is only about 2 years old. So I wanted to represent a lot of different regions. I also was drawn to entries that clearly had deeper cultural meaning. Like there's a lot of tomatoes up there, and it's because they're delicious tomatoes, and that's awesome. But then I was more drawn to something like the Carolina Runner peanut, which was a food that was thought to be extinct in the 1930s. It's considered North America's first peanut. It was brought here with trafficked Africans and grown almost exclusively in the garden of the enslaved. And now, even though it's been rediscovered as making a comeback, a lot of the seeds and the results of that comeback are in the hands of sort of white entrepreneurs, not going back into Black communities. So while I didn't know that whole story when I was first looking into it, just the idea that something can literally be lost and thought to be extinct from this planet almost 100 years ago can be rediscovered and regrown. Just the drama of that for me, it's those kind of stories that were like my first connections that made me want to explore a little bit more. And everyone I dived into didn't work out. Sometimes the threads just didn't pull right. The story wasn't long enough for a chapter. But now I'm also getting an opportunity to continue that exploration through a column that I'm writing for Gastro Obscura called Endangered Eats. So I'm pulling on some of the stories I didn't get to do in my book and also just discovering totally new stories along the way.
Oh, that's fascinating. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of endangered foods that are indigenous. They have indigenous connections or origins, and some of them communities may or may not want talked about. But can you talk more about that aspect of your project?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, there are wild items on the Arc of Taste. And while the Arc of Taste motto is sort of eat it to save it, meaning if we seek out producers and buy their products, these foods will be continued to be raised or grown. When it comes to wild foods, the motto is save it to eat it, where we have to teach being careful practitioners and collectors and foragers and stewards of wild foods too. So the places where we can really help indigenous nations preserve their foodways is when that food can be a commercially viable food source. For example, I write about the Navajo Churro sheep, which is the traditional sheep breed of the Navajo or Diné people. They are uniquely suited to the Southwest. Traditional Navajo weavings are made with the wool of this animal. But by introducing this really sort of luscious, sweet, not gamey mutton and lamb into restaurants and CSAs, that also provides a much needed monetary flow directly into people practicing traditional Diné shepherding, right? So it's like we can support indigenous groups with their foodways. In fact, it's a wonderful way to do so. We need to do so on their terms. Another great example is wild rice collected around the Great Lakes region. Many of the tribal governments, like the White Earth Nation, will sell real wild rice, hand harvested and processed on their websites. You can buy it directly from these nations. And reef net fishing is another great example. This is an incredibly sustainable, stationary fishing method that's practiced in the Salish Sea, which is the northern part of the Puget Sound. Not only can you buy direct from places like Lemmy Island Wild, but also Patagonia has a huge contract with reef net fishers, both indigenous and non, to buy their fished salmon too. So buying from Patagonia also supports this native practice.
And it turns out that actually over half of the chapters in your book talk about indigenous practices or foodways. Is that right?
Yeah, because when you're talking about endangered foods, as I stepped into this process, I realized that unfortunately you're often talking about indigenous foodways because the American government over a period of several hundreds of years, waged a campaign of colonization and genocide. And a lot of the Indian removals and Indian removal acts had less to do with America wanting that land than they did to want to subjugate a people. Because when your foodways are tied to your traditional homeland, where you've been living for in this part of the country 1 to 30,000 years. When you physically remove somebody from that space, you break that connection to those foods. Even if it's seeds you can put in your pocket, they might not do well where you've been moved to. So taking away indigenous foodways was one tool that the American government has historically used to oppress indigenous peoples. But this might sound a little bleak, but I think a lot of the messages in this book are really hopeful because a lot of the story is about what America has done, but also what indigenous nations are doing now, about the incredible adaptive capabilities, how these nations have been able to survive their cultures, and really what a reader can do to help indigenous nations perpetuate their cultures into the future.
Yeah, and you've just mentioned a couple of these challenges, the various barriers to the survival of the Arc of Taste foods and foodways, whether it's colonialism or enslavement. Sometimes it's capitalism, which creates
Yeah.
the monocultures that Big Ag prefers. And these our big existential problems. And you do a good job of weaving the history into each chapter. We get to know people, but we also get to know a lot of background, balancing those details with the individuals and communities who are alive right now and they're working to preserve, but also enjoy, right? Something delicious, culturally important, and sharing voices. Yeah. So can you talk about that balance between the historical background and the very living communities? I'm thinking about the Philae chapter, which has so many different characters, but you could use your own example.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, as a historian, the history doesn't resonate unless you connect it to the present. Like my whole pathway as a food historian is using the history of foods to talk about why we are where we are today as a people, right? And I think that as a historian, a scholar, a writer, a person, I'm not an either or kind of person. I'm a both kind of person. That yes, our industrial agricultural system is broken and we need to make sure we feed people fairly and cheaply. That yes, shopping at your farmer's market is good and it supports local farmers, but that's also not an equitable system to make sure everyone has access to good food. Yes, Whole Foods has delicious foods, but your corner Smith's or Albertsons or Giant Eagle or whatever you got also has great produce too. Just because it's in a grocery store and at a more affordable price doesn't mean it's bad produce. And I think also when people are supporting, when they think we should be eating heirloom everything and everything organic, they also don't realize how that shakes down for the average farmer trying to survive, or simply the logistics of growing food that people expect to have access to in different climates and parts of our country. Does that all make sense, Amy? I'm just not an all or nothing person. Often both our problems and the solutions are way more nuanced. So that in a way is the weaving back and forth of the past and the present, because it's also a weaving back and forth of, well, you know what? The Philae chapter is a great example. What the Ark of Taste writes about Philae is as dried ground sassafras leaves. It's a traditional Choctaw ingredient, and then it became a part of French, Creole, and Cajun cuisine, as well as the cooking techniques of enslaved Africans and free Black Americans around the Gulf Coast. Okay, that's the shortest explanation. Sassafras trees are doing fine. You can find them in your backyard. I don't think they grow in Alaska, but most of America, you know what they are. They're easy to ID. That being said, they're not doing well at the southernmost part of their range because of climate change. That being said, their range is expanding northward because of climate change. That being said, it's not the tree we're worried about, it's Philae, the ingredient that's made from it. What the Ark of Taste is seeking to protect is the traditional handmade way of making this ingredient, which is pounded with a mortar and pestle that are made out of hard woods. However, most people still make Philae at home who live on the Gulf Coast. You can buy it, but most people will process leaves themselves. One woman told me she puts the leaves in a pillowcase in her dryer and then grounds it in a food processor. Does that make her way of creating this ingredient wrong compared to the traditional method? Or can we both preserve the traditional methods of doing something, but also realize how important it is to preserve the ingredient itself and the tradition of cooking with that ingredient beyond with the tools that are used to make it?
Yeah, and what I also thought was fascinating about that chapter is that you have voices from those different communities who all use this cultural food. There's a Choctaw historian couple. There's a producer, somebody who famously made it publicly and is no longer around, but his story is being preserved. And there's your your friend with the dryer. So and all those people have voices.
My friend at the rental car place with the dryer. Yeah, and that's it, right? Because it is Philae is an ingredient that is. New Orleans, the Gulf Coast is an especially interesting part of America because of all the cultures that mix there, because of the segregation that still exists there, but it is a place where you can really, in a way, boil down American cuisine to its elements. As Jessica Harris, the famous food historian, said, she calls this idea the braid, where indigenous, Black, and European foodways come together to create American food. Like that is the most evident in the Gulf Coast, I think. So
Hmm.
you have to include those voices because there we're looking at an epicenter of a complex, not just foodway, but a cuisine of America.
Hmm. And in contrast with some projects of culinary anthropology, you put yourself as author, student, and eater as a character in the book, which is kind of embedded journalism or research
Yeah.
personal essay. And that form has distinct advantages in a few of your chapters. I'm thinking specifically about the Navajo churro sheep and the manuman or wild rice. As readers, we got to experience your introduction to these foods, and that made the history woven through these chapters more accessible, I think. Was that
Oh, good.
first person narration your plan from the get go, or did it have any effects on the storytelling that you didn't anticipate?
It's just the way that I've always written when approaching this topic. Back when I first started investigating food history through writing, I launched a blog in 2008. And at that point, I wasn't a nationally recognized scholar. I was just a person who had a background in public history, who I think even at that point was a decent researcher and had a lot of curiosity for a topic that I felt that the public was really interested in, but there weren't people sort of being the translators between academia and the rest of us, which is kind of what a public historian does. So I always wrote as though we were all going to go on a journey together and, always felt comfortable. And I really attribute some of the mentors that I had, especially Josh Ozersky, food writer who was at New York Magazine at that time, who's now passed away, that you can look like an idiot sometimes because that can make you really relatable. I think there's just so much honesty to that way of writing that, of course, I mean, it got me my first book contract, but it's just been a natural way to write. I am a researcher and historian. I am a scholar, and I use journalism within my work, but my work itself is narrative nonfiction, which allows me to be present in the story as a stand-in for you all, for everybody reading the story, to come along on this with me. It allows me to insert some of my personal opinion where that is appropriate, as well as balancing that with times when I am just sort of reciting the facts or describing what's going on. Not everybody likes it, Amy, to be honest. You can go through my Goodreads and, people sometimes hate the style of writing where the author has a voice and a presence. But, I sort of grew up loving authors like Sarah Lohman and Mary Roach and loving them as characters in their story. I found that it made it more relatable and, for me, a lot less dry. So
Yeah.
it's just what I do.
It's definitely relatable.
Thanks.
As you mentioned in the book, items in the Arc of Taste can be a cultivated crop, an endangered wild or domestic animal, a foraged food, and even, as we just discussed a little bit, a harvest or culinary technique. You have examples for all of these in the book, and I got the impression maybe that lost technique might be the hardest thing to preserve when there's no one, for instance, who remembers how to create or use a traditional reef net. No amount of interest in eating salmon could restore that lost knowledge. Which of the foods you studied for the book felt most endangered to you?
Which ones felt most endangered? That is an interesting question. I never thought about it that way because I do feel really hopeful in all of these chapters because I kept meeting people that were so engaged that in some cases had learned from scratch. That, like with ReefNet, the tradition sort of kept alive in memory in the community, but it had been about 80 years since a lot of people within the Lummi people had practiced reef net fishing, and it took a lot of mentorship and money from white communities to be able to invest in that. Like, we can do good things, white people. We need, and money is one of the best ways we can do it if you've got it. I think that I sort of end on a frustrated note. We started this interview, I talked about the Carolina runner peanut. It's back. It's not extinct, but it's also sort of stuck in this place where it's too small for modern peanut harvesters. And there needs to be a financial investment for growers to. It takes 5 to 10 years to grow out enough seed for it to be a viable commercial crop, and also to even be able to take it to like the commercial shellers with the other peanut crops. There's just all these logistics in the way. And so, yeah, it's here. The seeds are sitting in cold storage. It's safe. We won't lose it again. But as far as this being an item that we actually get to taste or enjoy, or that we can purchase as a way to support Black farmers, we're a long way from the infrastructure sure. So sometimes I think we fail in the idea of save it no matter what the cost. Yeah, sure, we did the peanuts here, but what is the value in that right now if we can't look at the entire system and realize where our money and efforts can really make a difference in making this, like, making access to it equitable? Because when it has appeared, it's been on high-end restaurants, right? And served to a very select audience. And I think that is the connection we're missing between saving endangered foods and returning their cultural components. Because commercial success is one way to do it, but I think it's often more important for foods to be returned to the small group that it's originally from if it's been lost from that group or maintained within that group than it does for you or I to be able to access it, Amy. If I had never gotten to taste any of the foods that I was writing about, I would still write about them because they're important to other people. It's not, in a sense, always about my personal experience. And if I did want to go taste those foods, well, then I went to the Navajo Nation. There are ways in all of these chapters for anyone to meet people where they are, because I think these foods are their most important and effective on their home turf anyway.
Sounds to me a little bit like a parallel with endangered languages, for instance, or anything that can survive versus thrive, right? So, so we could maybe have recorded a language or bits of a culture that's struggling, but if it's thriving, then it's thriving on its own, right? It's, babies are learning to speak this language and people are speaking it in community, or this food maybe, gets to be culturally important again because access is given to the right area, and it doesn't matter maybe that they can't commercially produce it with combines or whatever peanut machines are, but they have enough for themselves.
Yeah. Can I bring up another good example that I didn't necessarily write about in the book, but it's the Indigenous Seed Savers Network. A lot of work is being done in the past 5 to 10 years to rematriate seeds to Indigenous groups. Because, for example, I just wrote an article about the Cherokee Trail of Tears beans, which is a traditional Cherokee bean. It's been in Cherokee hands for 1,000 years and was carried to Oklahoma, but also exists in the Eastern homeland as well. You can buy seeds from Seed Savers, and you should. It's a wonderful green or dried bean, but there's a big difference between me growing it in my backyard and the seed being saved that way versus someone who is Cherokee having possession of those seeds. The Cherokee Nation now has its own seed bank where they grow and distribute their native seeds to the Cherokee Nation, whether they're living in the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, whether they're living on tribal lands out east, or whether they live in LA. Anyone who is Cherokee can request these seeds. They get to have something that connects them to their home and to their story. And also, as the people who are implementing this program told me, that there's this idea you cannot be Cherokee without Cherokee seeds. You can't be Cherokee without Cherokee foods. That cultural meaning is way more important to someone who is Cherokee than for me. So it's the thought of like, yeah, I should buy these seeds. It's interesting to grow them, but then also, can I take an equivalent amount of money and donate that to the Cherokee Seed Bank or to the Indigenous Seed Saving Network to make sure that there are other people who are getting these seeds to which they're more culturally important?
Each chapter has a recipe, and I wondered about how that came to be a part of the book. Personally, I found that even if I wouldn't have the opportunity to cook a particular recipe because the star ingredient might be challenging for me to get a hold of, thinking through the recipe gave me another way to consider that food. And I could maybe imagine eating it a little differently than just reading a description of a dish. Can you tell us about how you worked recipes into the book?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you felt that way, too, because there was, of course, as you can imagine, a little back and forth discussion as I presented my manuscript, where some of the recipes are totally accessible. Date nut bread. It's a delicious date nut bread, Amy. I highly recommend it. Others, as you mentioned, are not. There's a blood sausage recipe there where you have to have a freshly slaughtered sheep to do it. Not everyone is going to make that. And not only that, but the format between those two recipes is challenging, whereas the date nut recipe, invented in like the 50s, it's a very traditional Western recipe format. The blood sausage recipe was told to me by someone who was actively making it with me in front of me. And when I tried to fit that into this Western ingredients first, and then you do your steps, and I teach recipe writing classes, when I tried to fit that narrative into that format, it felt really wrong. It felt inappropriate for me as a white person to do to an Indigenous recipe, and it felt wrong for like the nature of that recipe. To me, recipes in my books add, as you kind of said, it's another layer to the narrative where you are understanding the food in a different way. And especially if someone is a cook, they can still read that recipe and visualize it for themselves. But also, I wanted to decenter narratives in the urban East. My publisher, my copy editor, my editor are all in New York based, and they might not have a freshly slaughtered sheep in front of them, but people in the vast physical landscape of America might. And it might be interesting for them to read how Navajo people make blood sausage, this traditional sausage of like slaughter time, right? So I try to be really, really inclusive in my writing, and that includes being inclusive of my readers and how they're not all going to share the same perspective. So for me, it's a different narrative tool. And after some pushback, I'm really glad that the maybe impossible recipes. Although bless you if anyone has tried to make like I threw like a 16th century Ojibwe recipe in there at an open, because I also cook over an open fire. So I sort of love being able to like work through these recipes. I would love to hear back if anyone has tried some of the more complicated recipes. But even if you don't, I think it still offers you an understanding of how that ingredient has been traditionally prepared and loved.
Hmm. You also took on the challenge of trying to grow some of these endangered foods, even though they might not be a perfect fit for your climate. Can you talk about that choice and how it worked out?
Yeah, because I just have this saying, like, you don't know what you don't know. You talk about immersive journalism, but you mentioned in my intro that I worked at a history museum. That was a living history museum where we were in costume and character. So we were doing things with our physical bodies. And there is a big difference between reading about something, especially reading about something historically, and trying it out and seeing what happens. Like when I put those peanuts in the ground, I never imagined how beautiful peanut plants are and what an incredible ground cover they are and how pretty the yellow blossoms are. And then they grow in this, there's only one other plant on the planet that grows in the way that peanuts grow, and that they blossom, but then they send this little, it's called a peduncle, into the ground. And so it like grows down out of the flower under the ground, and then that's where the peanut grows. It doesn't grow on the roots like a tuber does. And so watching that happen live in my garden and visiting and pulling up the leaves and seeing these little tentacle things going into the ground, like that's just such a joy. So I always say, like, make a little room in your garden for the less practical things just to see what happens. I've got some indigo seeds that I was given in South Carolina, too, and I haven't put them in the ground yet because also now I live in Nevada, and I'm still definitely learning how to grow a garden out here. It's a 3-season growing season, but in the summer, you got to have the right plants out there or they will just roast in the sun. That's the big thing that I've learned. But that also means that next year I'm going to start looking into crops that are from the Southwest, of which there are plenty, because these traditional crops know what to do out here. There's no fussing with them. So I don't know, just if you've got a little space, even if it's just a patio with a planter on it, throw a weird peanut in there, throw some indigo in there, see what happens. Like you don't know what you don't know, and you certainly want to put those seeds into the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I want to chat about the apple chapter, partly because I grew up in upstate New York, and there are varieties of apples there that I think are better than anything we can get in grocery stores on the West Coast, but partly because Edible New Jersey has a cameo in this chapter.
It
And
does.
yeah, can you talk a little bit about endangered apples and how Edible New Jersey played a small part?
Yeah, I think most people don't think of apples as being endangered. There they are in our grocery stores. But, how many apples do you actually see there day to day? And how many of those are heirloom apples? I mean, ironically, the Red Delicious is a very old apple variety. But through selection over the past 200 years, it's turned into a really terrible apple variety, But historical Red Delicious was something totally different. But at the same time, you've actually lost like 15 to 17,000 unique apple varieties. A lot of that's because those weren't eating apples or dessert apples. They were drinking apples. You made them into cider. And really the sort of second half of the 19th century to first half of the 20th century, with the temperance movement and prohibition, really sort of destroyed that industry. We're now seeing a cider revival, and people have become passionate about it's not too late to rediscover some of these old apple varieties. And I mean that in a very literal way. There are communities both on the East and West Coasts that look at old farm maps to find orchards that, have reporting systems. If you see an apple tree, or especially a clump of them together, they're finding trees that are almost 200 years old that are the last living examples of different apple varieties. And that's something I got to see play out almost in real time as I was writing this book, as an apple was rediscovered in upstate New York. And it was an apple that an author in Edible New Jersey had written an article about. Oh my gosh, but the name, not the Harrison, not the Canfield, not the Granny Winkle. It's the fourth one of the Newark Four is what they called it. I can't believe his name just dropped out of my head.
Is it the Pavachon?
It is the Pavachon. Thank you. So we have the Pavachon apple, which was one of 4 apples that was used to make Newark cider, which was considered the best hard apple cider in the world. But it was thought we'd never recreate it because the apple was lost. But there is a cidery outside of Newark called Ironbound that really wanted to try it. And so the CEO of Ironbound worked with an author at Edible Jersey. You're going to help me with her name, too. This is the perfect connection. I should have reread this chapter.
No, it's okay. Was it Fran McManus?
Fran McManus. Couldn't think of her last name. So Fran McManus wrote a story about the Pavachon, talking about maybe this is a way we can revive agriculture in New Jersey. She started talking to the CEO of Ironbound Hard Cider, and they kind of put together a wanted poster, which it has been a tool in rediscovering apples. Like, have you seen this apple? With an 1830s drawing and a description of it. And literally, this guy, Wes, he had property. He lived in Newark area, had property upstate, picked up Edible Jersey and was like, I think that's the apple on our upstate property. And it really... it's been verified as much as it can be now. It's being planted in the Newark area again. It's kind of extraordinary.
That's really fun. It was I think the most sort of whodunit kind of mystery chapter that you had, and that made it really engaging.
Yeah, and it kind of comes after a real success story with the Harrison apple, another apple that was thought to be lost, or at least no one was looking for it until the 1970s. And now there are tens of thousands of it in cider making orchards across the country.
That's pretty cool. It makes me really curious about the cider mill in my town. It's an old 19th century cider mill, and it's always produced fresh, not hard cider in my memory, of the last 50 years. And it makes me very curious if it was originally a hard cider mill.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If it was a cider mill, they weren't making sweet cider. Mills might have made sweet cider the day they pressed it. You could go buy some, but this is a temperance movement shift. That mill was absolutely making hard cider because it was a way to preserve that fruit and also make it more valuable. A processed food like turning apples into cider adds value. It's a value added product literally than just selling apples.
Yeah, it's pretty cool that that and several other mills in that central New York area survived Prohibition and are still around and making fresh cider for the most part.
And it was also the best way to make alcohol in places like central New York, where it's kind of cold, it's kind of wet. Barley doesn't do well there. Grapes do good a bit further north, right? But for a lot, it grows in regions that are sort of cold and wet, and other things to make alcohol out of don't grow. That's where you see cider. England, France, parts of Spain, New England. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned this already. Slow Food has a motto, eat it to save it. And we've been talking about how in a lot of cases it's not that simple. In the introduction, you say, I discovered the path to saving these ingredients wasn't clear cut, nor was the question of who should have access, like you mentioned with the Carolina runner bean. Can you talk a little bit more about that complexity and maybe give us another example of food or foodways where access, even by those for whom the food has cultural importance, is in jeopardy?
Yeah. Of course, starting on this path, I didn't know what I was going to discover, which is part of the thrill of nonfiction writing, I think. You can sort of put your thesis out there, but you don't know how the experiment is actually going to end up. And it was sometimes disheartening, but, I have a lot of respect for Slow Food, I want to say. But I put honest criticisms in there based on the things that I saw and people were saying, because it's an organization that's been around for 40 years and it is now growing and changing because it needs to grow and change. It needs to be thinking about these food systems in a way, we all do, in a way that was more complicated than 20 years ago when Michael Pollan was putting out his food writing, right? When the farm to table movement was happening, when, everyone was talking about being a locavore. It's more complicated than that. And a lot of those ideas of how to eat well and preserve foods are centered around whiteness and wealth. So we need to think about systems that are more inclusive, more equitable for those of us who do have privilege. How can we use that privilege and wealth to fix this entire system? For your question of items where that access is being threatened, I think coming back to this idea that Indigenous peoples are often protective of their wild plants, we can look at something like ramps. Now, this is an Indigenous food to the Americas. We're not talking necessarily specifically about there's a Indigenous group saying, hey, we don't have access anymore. But since this plant became popular about 15 years ago, as it began, as foraging picked up again, as it was being sold to restaurants and sort of experimented with, as it began appearing at farmers markets, it is now becoming threatened in its natural spaces. So if we over-harvest anything, any wild food, none of us will have access to it. So where is the line between ramps are delicious? It's really cool to be in tune with our native, local, wild foods. And they've become so popular that now they're too expensive for local people to access because it might be better for them to gather and sell. But that also, they become so popular that they're being over-harvested. White sage is not necessarily a food, but that is another big, big, big problem when it comes to Indigenous plants. White sage has been adopted by a lot of white ladies, by a lot of ladies of a lot of people of different backgrounds that are not Indigenous. And this is a traditional, incredibly important ceremonial plant. To me, it is honestly offensive to be saging out your house if you're not an Indigenous person. If that is a part of your religious practice, I'm sorry, but that part of your religious practice was made up if you're not an Indigenous person to the Americas. But if you want to incorporate sage into your life, your religious beliefs, please make sure that you're either growing the white sage yourself, which you can do. You can buy seeds online, or you are buying directly from an Indigenous group or a store that is open about its sourcing. Because white sage is being stolen from tribal lands. It is being ripped up by the roots. We're going to kill this plant, and a really important part of many Indigenous cultures, because we need to sage out our house to get rid of the bad spirits. Y'all got to stop. You got to stop, and you got to be more responsible, more thoughtful about where your plant is coming from.
Yeah, that brings up two ideas to me. One is, can you cultivate ramps? I mean, why aren't people just growing ramps?
It's a good question. I think like a lot of wild foods, you can certainly encourage ramps. I mean, but the easiest thing to do is it's an allium. Just don't harvest them all. As long as you leave some there, there will be just as many or more next year. The biggest way to save ramps is just make sure you take a little from here and a little from there and don't over-harvest them. Yeah, you could try ramps produce seeds. You can try to replant some of the bulbs, but they are a wild plant and they might not always be happy with what you give them. They want to make their own choices. But certainly we're also rethinking ideas about what agriculture is and where it started, because there has been a lot of evidence of Indigenous people from around the world and our pre-human ancestors encouraging plants to grow and making like the best conditions possible for wild plants to thrive, which is like pretty much agriculture. So I think that is an interesting thing to think about.
It also makes me just think about how important control of land is. If
That's it.
our
If you
so-called
build a
wild
house on it, there's not
spaces.
going to be any ramps there anymore.
Sure.
And that's been a big problem, not only for wild plants, but also for things like apple orchards.
Right.
New York State has lost a huge amount of farmland.
True. Yeah. And of course, even our so-called wild spaces, if they're not in the control of the people whose plants are culturally important, then they might not have access.
Yes, and now that Deb Haaland is Secretary of the Interior, she's an Indigenous woman. Secretary of the Interior is above the Bureau of Indian Affairs and also basically controls a lot of our public and private lands too, or our public lands at our national parks. She has really been working to restore land, give land back. If you hear land back movement, that's what that's a lot about, returning federal BLM land to Indigenous peoples, and also providing co-stewardship and access for Indigenous peoples to our national and state parks too. And the people who are caught poaching white sage in California, they are fined, they are arrested, they are punished. This is a serious offense, but like most illegal substances, it's not the sage itself that's illegal. It just depends on when it comes from. We can sort of, stop that based on our own actions and being a more conscientious consumer too.
So, the story of the Coachella Valley dates, which opens the book, is a story of an
Yeah.
intentionally imported cash crop, which over time fell into obscurity. And that sets it apart from a lot of the other stories that we've been talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about these dates? And is it maybe one of those stories that might actually be helped by more consumer interest?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And honestly, most of the things in the book, buying the thing will help the people. Like those are really the ones that I picked. Um, I think this is one of the first stories I connected to because it was just such sort of a delightful discovery about an area that I thought we all knew very well. I'm talking about the Coachella Valley, Palm Springs, Coachella Music Festival. That's the place. But at about 100 years ago, it was the center of America's burgeoning date industry. And, there are stories of colonialism in there, too, because it's a lot about the USDA plant explorers who basically went and in some cases stole crops from around the world to plant them in areas like Coachella, which because nothing was being farmed there, the American government saw it as unused land. Although, of course, there were indigenous people quite happily living there, governing the land, doing their own thing. But the idea, I mean, up until less than 100 years ago, was that if there's not a house or a farm on it, it's not being used. So they started growing these date palms. And the industry thrived until about the middle of the 20th century when really like the second and third generations didn't maybe want to be date farmers. There's still a huge date industry there. We grow about as many dates in Southern California as we import. But a lot of that land now that used to be small family farms is owned by like Dole, and they'll grow maybe two types of dates. What makes it special is that because the industry is so old there are varieties of dates that are now native to Southern California that are not grown anywhere else in the world and have always been sold by these small family farms. Dates produce basically baby palm trees. It is a palm. Baby palm trees kind of come off the base of the tree, and that's how you replicate the dates. They're genetic copies. You chop them off, you replant them. But date palms only do that for about 20 years of its 80 to 120-year lifespan. And so if a date of a certain old variety, if the tree still exists, but we've passed the point where it's producing those little baby palm trees, that variety is lost. When you plant a date, the pit has different genetic information in it, and it'll be a different date, which may or may not be good to eat. So there is a little bit of an urgency about, there are still small growers who exist. There are now some new small growers like Sam Cobb and Rancho Meladuco that ship their dates all over the country, and they are both growing American date varieties that are now over 100 years old, as well as growing some of their own special date varieties too. So it's a part of America's sort of agricultural industry now. These are plants that thrive in dry desert conditions, and it's a part of the sort of quirky culture of the Palm Springs area. And the dates are delicious, so.
Yeah, I loved the descriptions because I think a lot of us, maybe who don't come from that part of the world, don't think of, maybe we know two varieties of dates and maybe we could or couldn't tell them apart, So
most people think a date is a fig, which it's not. So it was a little bit of education as well, but that's the kind of wonderment of writing this book too.
Mm-hmm. Are there ARC entries that you wish you could have studied, or that I know you talked about your column that you're thinking about for the future?
Oh, I mean, yes. I'm so excited to be able to do this because, like I said, it's a mix of things that were kind of runners up for the book that I had to discard, but then also news stories that I'm coming across or heard about on my travels that I knew I couldn't pursue at all because of sometimes the stories weren't long enough. But honestly, Amy, you just run out of money and time. That book is due. Your advance is long gone. You got to wrap it up. You know what I mean? So you have to narrow the project down. So for example, I just reported, and maybe by the time this comes out, will have written about the Alberta peach, which I remember hearing about at Slow Food Nations, which is the annual festival that Slow Food puts on in Denver. And it was described to me as a peach so juicy you have to eat it over the kitchen sink. And I was like, I got to meet this peach. And the whole story of how it still exists is so special because it's currently being grown by Masamoto Family Farms, which is outside of Fresno. This is a fourth generation Japanese American farm family. Because the Alberta is an older variety that doesn't really ship well and doesn't fit our current retail standards, even the color of it, which in my mind, it looks like a peach, but it's not the kind of peach we're putting on the shelves in its appearance. But they wanted to grow up because the flavor is incredible. So they run a program called Adopt a Tree. And kind of like a CSA, in the winter, teams of 6 to 12 people adopt a tree for several $100s. It's like $600 to $800. Then they wait for their peach babies to ripen. You know, they sort of invest in their trees emotionally. And then 2 weekends towards the end of July or the beginning of August, people show up from all over the West Coast to this farm in Fresno to harvest. Well, this year it was like 400 to 500 pounds of fruit. It was a bumper crop. And then take it home and turn the bruised ones immediately into jam and pies, slice up others to freeze them and put them away the rest of the year. And it is this remarkable community event. The family, the Masamotos, they serve brunch to everybody when they're done picking in the orchard. Some people have been coming for 20 years. It's the 20th anniversary of the program. And it's also a really ingenious workaround to keep a delicious historical peach in the ground and get it out to people who can enjoy it.
Wow, that's pretty fun. Might have to check that out sometime.
It was really fun, and the peach is delicious.
Yeah.
So upcoming Gastro Obscura Endangered Eats that, and I wrote about the Cherokee Trail of Tears beans, and I wrote about a little pastry, the Sayo. It's Sayo, I think. The Sayo kolache, which Sayo is a town outside of Portland. So things that I came across and often made side trips to learn about while I was doing these national travels writing this book now have a home, and I'm so happy to be able to continue writing these stories.
That's exciting. And any new book projects on the horizon?
I am working about a book on the history of ice cream.
Oh, wow.
So history of ice cream coming at you sometime in the next 2 to 3 years.
Awesome.
I got to get writing, Amy. I got to get writing on this book.
Eating.
But I have been eating a lot of ice cream. That I've been doing. I've actually limited my sweets to only ice cream, and that has helped.
I love that for
because, now I can eat all the ice cream I want as long as it's only ice cream, because that's research, Amy. That's research.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, research is important, and I wish you all the best of luck. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for this conversation.
We've been speaking with food historian Sarah Lohman. Thank you for joining us today at Eat, Drink, Think. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to pick up your local edible magazine. You can find show notes for today's episode at ediblecommunities.com.